Hi. Oh, great. I'm live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel. And thanks for your patience with having us navigate some technical difficulties. I'm going to share my screen right now and start by introducing the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. That's the panel that you've come to now. So the Global Network was founded in 1992. Our major activities include an annual October Keep Space for Peace Week, which draws events in more than a dozen countries around the world. Pre-COVID, we had an annual space organizing, protest, and conference in a global community that hosts a space-related base or production facility. It is how we've been able to build strong relationships around the globe as we come together to sort of understand what this space issue means for all of us. There are about 170 affiliate organizations around the world for the Global Network. We have a Space Alert newspaper that's published twice a year. We hope that you'll visit our website, that you will visit our booth after this conversation, and that you'll join the Global Network. So this is our website. What I'm going to do right now is introduce you to the panelists that will be speaking today. And then the plan is for each of them to speak probably 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for conversation with the rest of you. So for myself, I like to call myself a pissed off social worker. I work for an agency supporting people who are experiencing homelessness in the wealthiest country of the world. It's an unacceptable reality as far as I'm concerned. I also live in Bath, Maine, which is where General Dynamics owns a shipyard that builds naval destroyers. And those naval destroyers exert the imperial power of the United States around the globe. So we're busy in this community. You're going to hear from two presenters today. Dave Webb is the convener and webmaster for the Global Network. He's also the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK. He started out teaching engineering at Leeds Beckett University and conflict studies, where he co-founded and directed the Praxis Center for the study of information and technology for peace, conflict resolution, and human rights. He's the vice president of the International Peace Bureau, a patron of the UK group Scientists for Global Responsibility, and he is always ready to share his wisdom, which is deep and profound, frankly, over a pint in a local pub. So Dave is going to focus on missile defense and the US space warfighting infrastructure. Linda Williams, unfortunately, is not going to be with us. Bandwidth is a problem for her in this particular moment. And so her plan was to discuss space war profiteering and space ecology. Dave and Bruce will both try to touch on those topics, but certainly I hope that you'll ask questions if you want more information about that at the end. Bruce Gagnon, full disclosure, he's my husband. He's also the co-founder of the Global Network. He is the coordinator and has been full-time since 1998. Just as Dave had a bit of conversion from engineering to peace studies, Bruce started out as a young Republican for Nixon and an organizer for such. Back in 1968, he was a Vietnam-era veteran, and he's currently an active member of Veterans for Peace. He was trained by the United Farm Workers Union in Florida, organized food pickers, and he coordinated the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice for over 15 years. His blog is called Organizing Notes. So Bruce is going to discuss missile defense and Russia. He'll go into some space treaties, look at 5G and the ozone. When he's finished, we'll open it up for questions and answers. Before we get started, I just want to say a word about missile defense. Our definition, missile defense is the shield to be used to destroy any retaliatory strikes that occur after a US first strike attack. It's really important for you to be grounded in the fact that it's not about defense. It is about control and domination. I also want to ground you in the consequences of war. This community knows that as well as anyone, but you're about to bear witness to lots of pictures of space weapons, technology, and one can get lost in the midst of all of this to impact the true impact of war. So I want you to sort of hold these young children in your heart. We all understand the deep trauma that occurs from war, and that conversation doesn't always, we can sometimes forget that when we're looking at the big picture of space. I also want to sort of hold Hamza and the stories that he shared with us yesterday. The fact that every 170 seconds, a Yemeni child dies from lack of access to food or water is an abomination for the world. And we want to hold that in our hearts as we watch the madness that you are about to hear described. Finally, I want to share with you this image that our artist friend Russell Ray here in Maine has created. We talk a lot in Maine about conversion. We recognize that paying our neighbors to build the infrastructure for control and domination of the planet through weapon systems is going to destroy all of us. And that as communities, we need to envision how we come together as a world community to cooperate and create an alternative energy infrastructure, an alternative transportation infrastructure. Otherwise, we won't survive the 21st century. So we hold that image. I hope that you'll hold your own image as we walk through this, the reality of space weapons and space technology and the impact it has on the planet. So, having said that, I'm going to now turn it over to Dave Webb.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you very much. If you can stop sharing, I'll share my screen as well.
You know, I'm having a hard time getting to leave. I'm sorry, but my computer's not cooperating. Here we go. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I'm actually going to, this is what Mary Beth sort of briefly said something about. I want to go into it in a bit more detail to show why we think it is not a defensive system, and maybe add a few more things as we go along. I didn't realize Linda wasn't able to come today, so maybe we can add some other things too as we go. So as I think really Mary Beth said, there's a myth of US missile defense, that it's defensive, that it's a non-aggressive system. Its only role is to protect the United States mainland and US allies from rogue states, so-called rogue states, and it's not aimed at all at Russia or China. Well, all of this is untrue, as we'll see as we go along. And it's probably worth recognizing in the first instance the aggressive intent. And in order to do that, we only have to remember that prior to 2002, the US nuclear posture consisted of a triad of nuclear weapon carriers. These are ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, bombers, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. But in 2002, a new triad was introduced, where the entire previous triad formed just one part, and two other aspects were introduced. These are a responsive infrastructure and active and passive defenses. So active and passive defenses, note. Basically, this includes the role of missile defenses. It was recognized that should the US issue a nuclear first strike on a major foe, then under a deterrence doctrine, there would be some retaliation. Even if the first strike were aimed at missile silos, not all would be wiped out, and some response, even if it was small, would be possible. So the missile defense systems would be available to just mop up such a response. A number of systems have been developed involving land, sea, and space-based components, and we see some here. We'll go into those in a bit more detail as well. These could respond, theoretically anyway, to incoming missiles at different times in the missile trajectory. So here is a slide that illustrates the different types of missile defense system that there are. First of all, there's this ground-based missile defense system, which is deployed to protect the United States mainland from ICBMs. Then there are other systems such as the Aegis system, which is based on destroyers, Aegis destroyers, which can sail anywhere, obviously, in the sea. Then there's theater high altitude area defense system, or PAC-3 systems. And you can see from this diagram that they're all there basically to counter different types of missiles: short range, medium range, intermediate range, or long range. And different types of missile not only involve different altitudes that they reach, but also different distances that they can travel. Ideally, an intercept would take place in the early stages of the missile trajectory before any decoys could be deployed, because one of the ways of fooling a missile defense system is to deploy thousands or hundreds of missile decoys shaped like warheads but aren't actually warheads, and it's extremely difficult in space to tell the difference between the two. So the chances of you actually being able to knock out a missile are very much reduced. A quick look at these different systems shows us how international they are. So, for example, the ground-based system incorporates satellite missile launch detection and coordination, ground-based tracking radars situated in the United States, in Greenland and the UK, and at sea, and anti-ballistic missiles fired from Alaska or California. As there are only 44 interceptors in total, the system could only be effective against a limited attack, especially more limited because the chances of it actually hitting a target at the moment aren't anywhere near 100%. Don't forget, we're talking here about hitting a bullet with another bullet, as it's often described. The Aegis as we'll see later on, we'll have a closer look at where they are positioned. In 2008, in fact, the US demonstrated how it's not only supposedly a missile defense system, but it can be used as an anti-satellite system. It was when it was used to shoot down a US satellite, which was in danger of plummeting to Earth with quite a lot of hydrazine fuel in the tank. At least that was their excuse for doing it. It was more likely to be a demonstration to people like China that it had that capability, because China also did a similar thing, demonstrated how it could knock out one of its own satellites in a similar type of exercise. And since then, we know that Russia and India have the same capability. So you can use missile defense, in other words, as an attack system for satellite systems in space. The THAAD system is a mobile ground-based system composed of radar, command and control, and launcher components, and it's deployed for high altitude interception. You can see there's a lot of information on this slide, which you don't need to worry too much about, but it's a US Army system The systems have been sold already to the United Arab Emirates, to Saudi Arabia and Oman. Japan has the radar, tracking and control radar, which has been deployed to Turkey, Eastern Europe and Israel as well. This is a higher altitude intercept system than the in a minute. Japan is also considering buying THAAD at the moment. And the US has deployed THAAD in Romania, Guam, Hawaii, Israel, South Korea, and Wake Island down there in the Pacific. The Patriot system, oh, sorry, no, this is THAAD again. These are the various components. So there's the radar system, the command and control vehicle, and the missile launcher. And these are mobile, as you can see here. These are pictures of them down at the bottom there. The Patriot system is, sorry, I've lost my space. Is a ground-based surface-to-air missile system for interception at lower altitudes than THAAD. The ship-based Aegis, THAAD, and Patriot systems are being sold to countries all over the world, as we just saw for the THAAD system in particular, but Patriot are also being extensively sold and are raising quite a lot of money for Raytheon, as you can imagine. So let's look at the US NATO missile defense system, which has been established in Europe. The US started its later combined with NATO to make it a combined US-NATO defense system. So this is composed of radar sites situated in UK. There's one in the northern top of Norway there, in Turkey, and also of Aegis ships, which are patrolling the Mediterranean and the Baltic region with these Aegis defense systems on board. And Aegis ashore sites. This is the Aegis system, but placed inside the countries Poland and Romania. This is the Aegis ashore system here, which is basically a launch system for missiles. And here are 4 of the NATO BMD bases, ballistic missile defense bases in Europe. So from the left, counterclockwise, it's Ramstein in Germany. This is the headquarters of NATO missile defense in Europe. Rota in Spain is where the Aegis destroyers are hosted. This is Kurchik in Turkey, where there's a very powerful radar system involved in the missile defense, and the Aegis ashore system in Romania. So there's also, as well as those being established in Europe, there's also THAAD, US THAAD deployment in the Pacific region. And we can see from here that THAAD systems are deployed in South Korea, in Guam, in Taiwan. What I should have said previously was, if you look at these, where these are stationed, you can see they're basically surrounding on the borders of Russia. So the idea that they're trying to prevent the so-called rogue states is really a bit unbelievable. Similarly, here you can see this, the THAAD systems are stationed around China, basically, and parts of Russia as well. So there are also space components of missile defense for tracking, for launch detection and tracking missiles when they're actually flying through there. So all of these are combined. So these seem to be focusing really on China and Russia. So if we look at the situation, we can see that it's Russia and China that are really the focus of attention here. So if we go through the various systems, looking on a world map in a bit more detail, you can see where they're actually sited, and the fact that they go around China and Russia where they're aiming at. Okay, so this slide also shows that if you look at the military maneuvers that are taking place in terms of the Pacific fleets and the other fleets that are going from the United States defense systems, it's clear that China and Russia are the focus. So they're being encircled basically by the US military as a way of kind of keeping them confined. So finally, missile defense systems are dangerously destabilizing because they make it possible for one side to have an advantage over the other. They make war more likely. They're part of a strategy to enable one side to strike first without fear of retaliation. They're generating, because if you have a big shield on the one side, then it leads to a bigger sword on the other. Progress in peace and disarmament talks, because one of the barriers always when you are trying to make some kind of headway with disarmament with Russia, between Russia and America, is Russia is demanding that the US takes its missile defense systems away from its borders, and the US refuses to do that. So basically that's my contribution for the moment, and if there are any questions, and hopefully there will be, then we can go more into more detail of some of these things. Over to
with UN treaties to ban weapons in space. Both Russia and China have long been offering treaties to ban weapons in space. So let me continue. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has given Elon Musk and other so-called space entrepreneurs permission to launch tens of thousands of 5G satellites into space. What that means is that we will soon have a 5G satellite orbiting over the head of every single human being on the Earth 24/7. At the same time, it means that orbits will become increasingly crowded. Think of a parking lot. The parking lot around the Earth is filling up. And when the parking lot fills up, you start having car crashes. Things start smashing into each other. There's a great fear of that inside of the aerospace industry, inside of the newly created Space Force. They're tracking all these bits of debris, some of them just tiny speck of paint, orbiting at 15,000 miles an hour. And as this happens, there will soon be the possibility of cascading crashes, one thing smashing into the other, creating even more space debris. Now, astronomers are very angry, by the way, about all of these launches of these satellites, because these blinking satellites are destroying the night sky that astronomers love to look at in the evening. But as things begin to crash into each other, as we have this cascading effect, what happens is we will see the Earth essentially go dark, because virtually everything we do on the planet Earth today, cell phones, cable TV, internet, ATM machines, weather monitoring, GPS, the list could go on all day long. All of these things that we do on Earth are hooked up to satellites. And when they start smashing into each other, crashing into each other, that means that we're going to lose connection to all of that. And so that space, the planetary orbits around Earth, must be viewed as an environment that needs to be protected from humankind's trashing. And this is where we are today. Now, toxic rocket exhaust. Every time there's a launch, we see major contamination of the air at places like Cape Canaveral in Florida, Kennedy Space Center, where they have a big natural preserve surrounding the launch center. After every launch, there are all kinds of wildlife kills, especially birds and fish, because as the toxic pollution descends back to the earth, it mixes with the water, and the water becomes contaminated. But in addition, the ozone layer is increasingly being destroyed because of these toxic launches that are happening. And so shouldn't we begin to wonder if this idea of launching tens of thousands of satellites for 5G on hundreds, if not thousands of rockets is going to really wipe out the ozone layer? So all the things we're doing on the planet today to try to deal with climate change are being negated by this whole launch program that the United States particularly is moving forward with. Now, a bit about 5G applications. The Pentagon is very excited about 5G because it will make their military connectivity between satellites, ground warfighters, airplanes, missiles, the ships in the ocean, you name it. Everything is connected by space technology today. All warfare on the planet is directed, coordinated by space technology. So 5G will increase that, giving the Pentagon better surveillance, global surveillance capability, and also better targeting capability. Let me read to you very quickly a quote from one Pentagon source talking about this. Data gathered through 5G and from former generations of 3G and 4G, satellites and AI will provide the means for a capable commander to take the entirety of the data and information gleaned by the sensor grid, this updated sensor grid because of 5G, be able to determine adversary plans and the decisive points in an adversary system of systems and commit their forces against them. So basically, they're saying that 5G is going to exponentially increase the capabilities of the quote-unquote warfighter, giving the United States a clear advantage over countries like Russia and China and others. Now to discuss a bit about Russia. Recently, we've heard a lot of criticism when Russia held war games inside their own country, near their border with Ukraine, as the US-backed Ukrainian regime in Kiev that was brought into power in 2014 after a US orchestrated coup d'etat. The US has been arming, training Ukrainian military, Ukrainian neo-Nazis, death squads in brigades called Azov Battalion and other such things. They're mostly from Western Ukraine, where they have a long history of Nazi support. In fact, when Hitler swept through Ukraine in his invasion of the Soviet Union during World War II, Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis in Western Ukraine, put on Nazi uniforms and joined Hitler as he killed Jews and killed various people in the former Soviet Union. And so today, since the 2014 coup d'etat, the US has been training these Ukrainian forces to go to eastern Ukraine, right along the border with Russia, right where that boot is in this picture you see. This area is called the Donbass region. And people in that region are ethnically Russian. They speak Russian. And one of the first things that happened after the 2014 coup, this new US directed government outlawed the speaking of Russian in Ukraine. And so the people in the Donbass, right along the Russian border, began to peacefully march, gather petition signatures, saying that they wanted a federated Ukraine. They wanted to be able to make local decisions, decide on their own language, elect their own local political officials. And once they began doing that, exercising democracy, they were attacked by these Ukrainian forces, these Nazi forces. And since that time, more than 15,000 people have been killed. It's claimed that Russia invaded Ukraine. That's not true. But what is true is that Russia did give these people in the Donbass, mostly miners, teachers, musicians, electricians, people who just came out of their regular lives to try to arm themselves to protect their families and their land. Russia did give them weapons so they could defend themselves against this onslaught. And today, NATO and the United States are having war games right along this very same region, right up against the Russian border. Here's an illustration of an expanding NATO. When the former Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, then the president was George Herbert Walker Bush, Daddy Bush, and his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, promised Mikhail Gorbachev, then the premier of the Soviet Union, that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward towards the Russian border. But when Bill Clinton became president, he violated that promise. And today NATO is on steroids. And here in this particular illustration, you see NATO expansion right up against the Russian border. And now they're trying to get into Ukraine and Belarus as well. NATO, again, as I said, is right now, currently at this very moment, having war games in this region, but they have war games in this region all the time. This is, in fact, a military document showing where Army, Navy, Air Force, and joint activities have been held, wargaming an invasion of Russia in Eastern Europe. At the same time, the United States is holding war games in the Nordic region, in Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway. And here is one example of a naval war game pressing up towards the Arctic region, where the ice is now melting because of climate change. I would submit to you one of the key reasons for the demonization of Russia today, for the increased activity both in the Nordic region and in Eastern Europe, the destabilization of Russia, is because Russia has the largest land border with the Arctic Sea of any country on the earth. And the Western oil corporations want to get to it. They want to control that part of the world. They want to be able to drill, baby, drill in the Arctic. And they want to stop Russia from being able to do the same. It's competition for oil and natural gas and other minerals that now are essentially easier to get to because of the melting ice. This is another diagram of the various aspects of missile defense. I live in Bath, Maine, where on the left side you see the Aegis Navy destroyer. It's outfitted with missile defense systems. They build these 2 blocks from my house here in Bath, Maine. And this is an illustration where the Aegis are encroaching constantly closer and closer to the Russian border. Now I ask you, what would the United States do if Russia or China were putting warships with missiles on board in the Gulf of Mexico or on the Atlantic or on the Pacific, right up against the US coast? Earlier, Dave talked about how 2 Aegis ashore sites are being built, one in Poland. This is the one in Poland, the groundbreaking a couple of years ago, and then one in Romania. Romania has already been built. Now, at these sites, the US will be able to launch Aegis ashore missile defense systems in an attempt to pick off Russian retaliatory strikes after a US first strike attack. So again, the key is first you launch an all-out first strike attack against Russia and China, something that the United States has refused to renounce. Both Russia and China for years have renounced first strike attack. US refuses to do so. So anyway, after a first strike attack on Russia and China, they then fire whatever remaining nuclear retaliatory capability they have. And it's at that point, the so-called missile defense systems, very close to the Russian border now, because of all these deployments, tries to pick off their capabilities, giving the US a successful first strike attack, as the Pentagon would say. At these same Romanian and Poland launch facilities, they can also fire first strike attack nuclear capable Tomahawk cruise missiles aimed at Russia that would reach Moscow and other targets in a very short period of time. So what we really have here is a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. Again, what would the United States do if Russia and China was to encroach on us the way we're doing to them? Now, for more than 20 years, Russia and China have been going to the United Nations, introducing a resolution called PEROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. The idea is, let's close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. Let's ban all weapons in space. So during Democrat and Republican administrations for the last 25 years, maybe even 30 years, this has been introduced at the General Assembly in New York at the UN by Russia and China. The US and Israel have been blocking the development of this treaty ever since. Why? I think the answer is obvious. Let me conclude with this. This is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute figures for 2018. The US, 36% of the global total of military spending. You see China at 14%. And if you look down the right side, about the 4th or 5th one down, you see Russia at 3.4%. Now you should know that in the last 2 years, Russia has cut their military spending because Putin has said they need to spend more on economic development. So their figure is even less than 3.4% now. When you add up all the numbers of the US and the NATO allies and partners, what you get is more than 60% of the global total of military spending is US NATO. So is it possible that Russia wants to take over Europe at 3-point-something% of the global total while US and NATO have 60%? I don't think so. The numbers don't lie. Thank you very much, friends, for listening. And we'll look forward to, if we have any remaining time, to taking questions. Thank you.
So I think Dick is joining us in a minute. Bruce, you should put yourself on mute. When David joins, hey Dave, okay. So I've been paying attention to the chat and there are a few questions that have emerged already. Why don't I start? But I will warn you all that I've been having some connection difficulties. And so if you lose me, you can sort of do this without me. But one question came in from John. He said, why pick on China and Russia? Leaders have manipulated to stay in power from both of these countries, but their crimes are peanuts compared to other people's crimes. So hang on to that, because Pia responded by saying, identifying two issues. One is BRICS. Could that be why China and Russia? And the other is cyber warfare attacks against the United States. So which one of you two wants to start? Go ahead, Bruce.
Go ahead, Bruce. Yeah, Bruce.
Take on the cyber. Actually, Russia and China have been asking the U.S. to also sign a cyber for years. U.S. refuses. The U.S. is the leading cyber warfare military in the world. The spending on U.S. cyber warfare technology since the Yugoslavia war, when it was first used against Yugoslavia, the U.S. crawled inside of their computers prior to the U.S. Nato attacks. This was during the Clinton administration, on Belgrade and other cities inside of Yugoslavia, shut down their air defense system so they could not protect themselves. So no U.S. NATO warplanes were shot down during that war. So U.S. has been using cyber for years, but accusing the other side always of being the aggressor. So if the U.S. was really serious about wanting to deal with cyber, they would agree to a treaty.
Dave, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, when you asked the question, why China and Russia, I think the US has stated already that it sees China as a So I think that's fairly obvious. It's worried about the economy, it's worried about its military strength, it's worried about all sorts of things. With regard to Russia, I don't know why they're so scared of Russia. Russia hasn't been particularly aggressive towards the United States, except in its own defense. I think maybe they're looking all the time, the arms manufacturers, the aerospace corporations are looking to kind of invent, if you like, enemies, or at least buoy them up. So it gives the politicians a reason for buying all their equipment. So some of this is led by the corporations and the military in order to further their own ends, I think.
Thanks, Dave. So Al Midi asked this question. Curious if the pro-satellite and pro-militarized space lobby would argue that artificial intelligence can control the traffic in space and prevent collisions, unless the collisions are intentional.
I don't think so. I think there is so much space debris now that there's no way of controlling it. You can't control scraps of broken up satellites and rockets and everything else that are orbiting the Earth at 15,000 miles an hour. There's no way of controlling it. There's no way of cleaning it up. And when you now introduce all these additional thousands of satellites up there, you're just creating essentially more targets to be crashed into. So the whole thing is crazy. It's really absolutely crazy. And no one is really dealing with it at all within the government or any of these corporations.
I could just add that, there have been some accidents, some collisions in space between satellite systems. And I think it may be part of that, may be the reason why they use it. They say they're using these particular systems, but actually you can't. You can only use AI if you know the trajectories or the orbits of all the stuff that's up there. And I think, as Bruce has said, more or less, we know where the satellites are. We know where certain sized objects are, because you can detect them from the Earth by radar or by very powerful telescopes. But they're very small pieces, very tiny bits around all over the place. And it only takes a very tiny piece traveling at that speed, 15,000 miles an hour, to just shoot through a satellite. And if one of those satellites, which involves an important function, actually gets knocked out during a time of international tension, who knows what the repercussions might be? It could easily lead to some kind of nuclear exchange. So we have to be very careful what we're expecting of space and what we think we can do in there.
So here's a question from Amy. Why do people trust that these systems will not be hacked?
Well, they might be hacked. I'm not an expert on that. Dave might be able to say more about that.
Yeah, they might be hacked. That is one of the difficulties. And it's one of the problems that the UK has with its nuclear weapon system too. It's all based on submarines, and they can be hacked as well. So it's a big problem. It's a big problem. They say that if you isolate your system, the computer systems away from international networks and so on, that they're safe. But it's been shown, I think, that that's not altogether true, that things can be introduced into systems while they're being maintained, or when there's people just put in their USB to play a bit of music on a submarine, and suddenly it involves a virus being exchanged into the system. So they can be hacked. They can be all sorts of problems can lead from that. So yeah, I think we've seen the success of hacking with the Iranian in the nuclear power were hacked by Israel, and they were made to go spin round too fast and basically exploded.
So Al asks, are there any NATO countries wanting to leave NATO or willing to press the U.S. to end NATO?
Well, one of the problems that we've seen is that just as the United States did a regime change operation in 2014 in Ukraine, and recently, just a month ago, tried to do one in Belarus as well, again, right along the Russian border. For years, they've been doing regime change operations throughout Eastern Europe. So a lot of the new governments that have joined NATO that used to be part of the former Soviet Union, these people came into power because of a U.S. regime change operation. Many of them went to the United States for education. They went to Harvard, they went to Yale. Some of them are absolutely CIA directed people that are sent back to run for office. The U.S. supports them. So, this is how the U.S. operates throughout Eastern Europe today. And so, while a lot of people in those countries oppose their country being part of NATO, we hear that all the time. Their governments are increasingly, like ours, controlled by corporations. I want to say something. The aerospace industry has long said that Star Wars will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. I call it pyramids to the heavens. And some years ago, in one of the industry publications called Space News, they had an editorial saying, we need to come up with a dedicated funding source to pay for all this stuff we're doing in space. And we have, and we're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure it. And they said it's the entitlement programs, which officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the welfare program that is now in tatters. So these are the programs that the military industrial complex has identified for defunding in order to pay for this new arms race in space. I urge people to go to our website and also go to our booth, if you will, in the expo section, and look at the links that we put in there. On our website, we have articles, we have newsletters, we have many videos about all these issues from many different parts of the world.
So Greta or Rachel, if one of you could sort of put into the chat how many minutes we have left. Do we need to finish this by 4:15, or can we go a few minutes over? Caroline has a question. Is the organization measuring the environmental impact of rockets in space, including 5G and every other element? Are they going back to atmospheric nuclear tests and further to measure that as well? And if so, who are they?
Well, I'm not sure there are is anybody measuring these effects. That's the problem. I mean, we have seen examples where under the launch sites, I think in Florida, there was contamination of vegetation by the rocket fuel. And people have noticed that because it caused medical problems to many people. But I don't know there's been a real full-scale study into what effects the rockets do have on the upper atmosphere, whether they ruin the ozone layer, or they do have obviously have some effect on the ozone layer. How big it is, when should we be concerned about it? What should we do about it? None of those things have ever really come about in an official investigation. So far more needs to be done. And the same with 5G. Far more needs to be done to understand the effects of microwaves, which are being beamed at us all the time from space and everywhere else. On what effects do they have on our health, on our brain, etc. It's not really very well known, I think.
Okay. I think we probably need to end. Let's sort of take one final question from Maboab. Can't the people of the USA socially boycott the arms merchants?
It's a problem because, we don't really buy products as individuals from them. It's our government that is handing over our tax dollars to these weapons corporations. But I think there's a bigger problem. I think that the decision has been made that U.S. isn't going to make shoes, refrigerators, cars, watches. We're going to let the corporations go overseas, use cheap labor. America's role under corporate globalization, according to Thomas Barnett, former Naval War College professor and author of a book called The Pentagon's New Map. America's role under corporate globalization, he said, will be security export, endless war to support the interest of corporations around the world. And that's why our local communities are addicted to military spending, that all we hear is jobs, jobs, jobs. We can't cut the military budget because of jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, the empirical evidence from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst Economics Department and Brown University show that military spending is the worst way to create jobs. That if we were invest into building commuter rail systems, offshore wind turbines, solar power, tidal power systems to help us deal with climate crisis, we would create more jobs. So these are the kind of things we need to be talking about as we oppose various weapon systems, as we oppose war. We need to be talking about our communities' addiction to military production and the need to convert the military industrial complex. Otherwise, there's not really any answer, any survival available to us, no way out the door. So this is something we have to integrate these messages as much as possible. And also, finally, we have to talk about this broken spirit of the American people, where we just go on in this endless war using our tax dollars to kill people around the world. We need to heal our spirit, our connection to the Mother Earth, our connection to all life on the planet. We have a real spiritual crisis in this country. Thank you all so much for watching. And again, go to our website and check out the work of the Global Network. And
just everyone noticed that Greta put in a link to the chat for the booth. And so Bruce and Dave can go over to that booth, and any specific questions you can go there to ask. Thank you all. Thanks for Greta and Rachel for the technical support. Bye.